This lecture will take a look at the some of the post-war problems in understanding the development of Holocaust studies. Also, its memory and different forms of memorial. And I'll also say a few general words about what I think the lessons from this class, the lecture series, has been. I will discuss in detail a few of the literary forms of the Holocaust that I haven't had a chance to get to yet. I will look at the future of different forms of Holocaust memory, site preservation, different forms of visits to Holocaust sites, and the transition to the post-living memory of the Holocaust. Now, here I want to just observe a few aspects of the Shoah that should now be evident from our study, and I call these the paradoxes. Paradoxes are something that is not self-evident, let's just say, not reflexively obvious. And let's just go through these. The first is that though the extermination sought to completely eradicate Jews and the memory of Jews, nonetheless, during the process of extermination, there was always a level of normalcy that is really pretty remarkable. For example, in the ghettos, we saw there was an impressive depth of culture in the ghettos. We studied the example of the Warsaw Ghetto and the attempt by historians there, led by Emanuel Ringelblum, to document the level of culture. Children go to school in the ghettos. They take music lessons, even when their deportation has been announced, even when the leadership of the ghettos knows that the following day the children will be exterminated. Nonetheless, that evening, the children have to do their homework. They have to practice violin or piano. Life continues. Now, another aspect of this question of normalcy. If we look at the literature, the memoir literature, or the interviews, the testimonies, one thing that becomes clear is that on some level, even for the inmates at Auschwitz, life continued, including the possibility of being bored, including the possibility of being happy. And we could look at Istvan Kertész or Primo Levi, or we could also look at Marceline to see examples of friendship, which maybe Levi isn't so quick to admit. The second paradox, which we learned about earlier in term, is that contrary to what may have been assumed about the nature of Nazi authoritarianism, no Germans were compelled to participate in killings, in any of the killing fields. And that's one part of this. So on the one hand, Germans were not required to be a part of these killings. The other amazing thing about this is that in some of the killing fields and in some of the more notorious human events of the Holocaust, there were no Germans present at all. I'm talking about, for example, the roundups of Veldiv or the massacres that occurred in the Holocaust by bullets. And we studied all these things. One of the lessons from literature, including Levi and Adorno and Wiesenthal, maybe also Marceline, and many others too. I think, especially if you look at the recorded testimonies from the Fortunov set from that began in 1989, the Holocaust certainly changed the human condition. It resulted in a radical transformation in consciousness, in human relations to one another in question, in just in the fundamental questions of humanity, but also in the way language is used. And the other, well, this is probably not a paradox, but it's a fact of post-war, post-processing of the Holocaust, is the problem of representation that we've been wrestling with for the last couple of weeks. And this is explored or commented on, and we can look at the different works and we can see how the great variety of representations and how inadequate that canon is ultimately. But we're also impressed at how far people keep trying. Now, new topic, and here again, I just want to present some of my own observations of what we've been studying, and these are just 9 different points that I want to mention, maybe not belabor too much. One of the features of the Shoah, of the extermination, is that it is not just the assassination of victims. It is not just their murder. Along the way, there was a priority of maximizing the humiliation and the suffering. There's no question about that. There is never any suggestion that the mechanics of the Shoah should be humane. Number 2, the extermination was the result of a major cooperation, a plan, a conspiracy, whatever you want to call it, among industries, networks that were required to firstly dispossess and arrest and assemble and deport and murder all of these, the 6 million. And this didn't take place in a narrow sphere that linked the leadership in Berlin with the SS camp leaders in the field. No. Along the way, there are innumerable people and concerns and industries that are involved. Number 3, the crime was concealed and denied as it was taking place. And I'll come back to this a little later when we look at the question of denial and how Holocaust denial links in with the nature of the crime itself. Number 4, which we've mentioned, speed, acceleration, the rush, the need to accelerate. And where in the death camps, where they actually discuss speeding up the process of death, abandoning the use of the internal combustion engines and moving on to gas pellets, Cyclone B. Well, this isn't about being more humane. It's about processing more Jews in a day. Number 5. The main events of the Holocaust take place in a context where the Germans and German allies assumed that there would be no rescue and that there would be no protest, that internationally there would be indifference, not ignorance, but indifference to the plight of the Jews. And this, when we see how the Shoah unfolded, really in plain sight, then it's clear that there was no expectation. Let me put it this way. There was no fear by the Germans that internationally anyone would intervene with the extermination. And we could take that further. It's also true among people living in Germany itself and the occupied states, so that the Germans assume global indifference to the plight of Jews, which isn't the same thing of assuming that everyone in the world had the same exterminationist hatred of Jews. No, not at all. But no one was going to stick their neck out or help Jews except for a very small number of of local citizens in occupied Europe who were, of course, identified and given the title righteous among nations. Number 7, we've seen this on occasions looking at different forms of evidence, but it is true that the death factories, the concentration camps, they were not off in a distant place like in, for example, Siberia, where the Tsarists and Soviets had sent their dissidents, and it really was a wasteland, environmentally and culturally. But no. In the Holocaust, wherever you had the death factories, you had high culture that was being enjoyed alongside the production of corpses. So the Germans maintain their high culture. These are not barbarians. They maintain and raise up, exalt their culture, almost perhaps in some ways an exaggerated way, drawing attention to their culture even as they can see the filth that Jews in the camps are forced to live in. Lastly, I mentioned this before, all of the perpetrators and collaborators in the Holocaust, they were Christians. They weren't Muslims. They weren't Jews. They weren't raised as atheists either. They were raised as Christians, all of them. Now, I have flashed this before, but I just want to draw your attention to the different forms of this problem of post-war memory. It really goes across the whole gamut. So it includes opposition to memory and memorialization in the Soviet Union, in Germany, in the United States, in the UK, in the Baltic countries, in Eastern Europe and Poland, in Italy, in Israel, all across the world. There is a struggle to understand what form memory will take, and I'll be talking more about this here. And the reading assignment for this lecture is an article that appeared, I think, 3 years ago, and it's about the problem of the public history of the Holocaust in Germany. So I'm asking you to read that. And I don't think I've assigned anything else apart from my reading on Marathon Man. So read that article. I think the piece is called Monuments to the Unthinkable. Is that right? Smith, is it? Right. Well, let's talk about a few of the literary forms of the Holocaust that I haven't had a chance to come to yet. And believe it or not, we really haven't talked that much about Holocaust historiography. We have looked at the different staging points that led to the emergence of sub-themes in the Holocaust, and we situated these in the sweep of the post-war period. And some of the key staging points, of course, were the 1970s with the 1978 Holocaust miniseries on American television, the 1980s with with Shoah, the 1990s with Schindler's List, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the opening up of a post-Soviet, post-communist memory of the Holocaust. And we looked at the turning point that was the publication in 2000 of Jan Gross's Neighbors. And we've seen in the last 20 years different kinds of Holocaust literature to emerge, and I'll be talking more about those here. But let's just dispense with these subtopics and as quickly as we can. Yeah, we haven't really talked about the first Holocaust histories, but certainly the most important one to emerge just 15 years after the war was Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews. This, well, it's perhaps not a work that is aged especially well. It's a work that was based almost entirely on captured German documents and records. So it's a top-down forensic view of arrest and deportation and transport and the and of the implementation of the final solution. And it doesn't really regard the Holocaust from the point of view of the victim, in part because there was still so much more ahead in terms of the collection of interviews and the creation of a canon of memoirs. There was still no talk at this time of PTSD, no attempt to get the stories from those who had survived. So this is an important work, but one that really is of its time. Along the way, not least beginning in the 1970s, you had a wave that was actually geographically delimited, but nonetheless, there were a number of key sensational Holocaust denial events. They originated in France and with the person of Robert Faurisson, a professor of literature, and his claims that Auschwitz was not the site of extermination, that the Germans did not deliberately kill the Jews. These declarations led to many French survivors finally finding their voice and beginning to provide testimony and write memoirs. The other is a British historian, specialist in Adolf Hitler and the Germans and the Nazis, David Irving, who did time in Austria and was arrested several times, and who has long become a pest among serious scholars of the Holocaust. I mean, we could have a whole discussion on what should be done with deniers, whether the Holocaust denial should be made illegal, if those things should be censored, if they should be allowed to circulate in a marketplace of ideas. What should happen to David Irving? Should he be thrown behind bars? Well, if you jail someone for because you disagree with what they've written, then that's essentially then your idea of free speech is the same idea as Goebbels. I mean, Goebbels was for freedom of speech unless it was something he disagreed with, and then he'd throw you in a camp. So I always thought, I don't know, maybe I'm changing my view on this, but I always thought that the case for denial was so weak that it was better to let these guys make their case and then rebut it with evidence. We have enormous evidence that the Holocaust occurred, but maybe with the latest resurgence of Jew hating, I might modify my position. But I want to move on. The graphic novel was emerged in really first in the 1960s, but more spectacularly in the 1980s with the publication of Art Spiegelman's Maus. Some of you might have read this with me in an earlier class, but I really urge you to check this out if you don't know it. It's only the most celebrated, but far from the only treatment of the Holocaust in the form of a graphic novel. A figure we haven't looked at yet, and there's no reason for it other than I can't do everything, is Norman Finkelstein. I call him the dissident. He's certainly the gadfly of the whole of Holocaust historiography and memory. His seminal book that is out now, I think 25 years. I should have put the year of publication there. I didn't. I think it's the late 90s or early 2000. But his book on the Holocaust industry, or it's called The Holocaust Industry, reflections on the exploitation of Jewish suffering. His book was really an important moment in Holocaust historiography because he finally someone was interrogating the process of commercialization and asking questions about the priorities of Holocaust memory and publications. And among his points is that Holocaust suffering has been exploited for political and ideological reasons. And this is closely allied with the policies of Israel against its neighbors. And Finkelstein's point is that Israel's aggressive genocidal mistreatment of its neighbors is justified with reference to Holocaust suffering. Now, there's another literary form here that bears mentioning. I don't know how deeply we can go into it, but that's the hoax. And there have been a number of noted Holocaust hoaxes. Perhaps the most recently covered is the story of Misha de Fonseca, a girl from Belgium who created a memoir I guess now about 25 years ago, around the turn of the millennium. This memoir was discovered as a literary and historical masterpiece, and it was published in many languages and turned into a French film in 2007. She became a figure who, especially in France, though also in Austria and Germany, did many school visits and book club signings. She was, for a few years there, she was a real celebrity. And she made it all up. And all you need to do is look at the story. You don't even need to know that much about history or the Holocaust or the problem of children in the Holocaust, but certainly the whole story that she was actually rescued and raised by wolves behind the lines in occupied Europe for several years. Never mind that, but it took a historian and an investigative journalist to go into archives and go into the records of different schools to find that she wasn't Jewish. She was a Catholic girl who had a relatively normal childhood in occupied in occupied Belgium, and then later in life, for whatever reason, she identified with Jewish suffering, and she created this fake memoir. There are others like this. There was the book by Benjamin Wilkomirski, who also claimed to be a Jewish child of the Holocaust, very celebrated, translated book, and it turns out he made it all up. He was never anywhere near the Holocaust. He was actually living in Switzerland during these events. And why you would create a hoax about your connection to the Holocaust, I suppose, I don't know. If I wanted to be charitable, I would say that these people must have responded to Jewish suffering to an extreme level, and they desired to pick up that Jewish suffering and make it their own. I mean, I have met non-Jews who were completely absorbed in the Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. I had a next door neighbor for some time, and she actually converted to Judaism. She wanted that suffering to be in her DNA. She wanted to own that suffering. Yeah, there's a Seinfeld episode about this as well. But we don't have time to look at all these things. Right. Well, okay. Those are a few literary forms that I had to dispense with that we really haven't had a chance to cover. But now I want to look at the future of Holocaust studies, and I'm suggesting that there are five different uh, sub areas, subfields of the Holocaust that will in part at least be its future. The first of these is the uh, digitization project and the collection and organization of photography. One of the remarkable things to happen in the last few years is the rediscovery of Holocaust photographs. Many of these are perpetrator photographs, but not all. And we also have a number of drawings that also provide a different kind of visual evidence of the events of the Shoah. Perhaps it was inevitable that troves of photographs would reemerge. They were widely held as trophies by Wehrmacht soldiers, and so atrocity, perpetrator photos, trophy photos, these were collected. They were often returned to Germany, and they ended up in people's attics or basements, if you had a basement, in boxes to be discovered by children and grandchildren, or maybe great grandchildren. Some of these boxes may not be open for another 50 years. I myself was in a Berlin apartment once. I knew someone in 1985, German. I was doing something with him at the university. We were actually exchanging language lessons. Anyway, he was a professor there at the Free University in West Berlin. And he had me over once, and he took me up. It was literally going up to the attic and showing me the box of his grandfather, or maybe it was his father. I think it might have been his father. A box from he had inherited from his father that was full of Nazi memorabilia and all kinds of little things that would have been precious during the Nazi period, but you had to keep in your attic at that point in the 80s. Nonetheless, he didn't throw these things out. He didn't give them to a museum. He was just hanging on to them, and I think he occasionally looked at them, and with some fascination, and he was willing to share them with me, or show them to me. So I wouldn't. Nothing is implicated in anything I just said, except that this material evidence exists. And it's out there, and little by little, we're getting our hands on it. Right. So you have not only do you have the emergence of new troves of photography, for example, but you have scholarship that is now interrogating the meaning of these icons. So you have new iconographical analysis that I would say was virtually unheard of in the last, before the last 20 years. So you have, of course, the work on the Auschwitz album, which is still displayed everywhere, as I pointed out in that, I think it was that week 8 lecture. You have the comparative approach now to photographic evidence and to sketch evidence. And what we've discovered, or one of the conclusions I reached in that lecture when I was talking about photography, was that if you have in the Auschwitz album of Lily Jakob, you have almost 200 pictures, and you have just a few sheets from the Auschwitz sketchbook, we know that the sketchbook tells the truth and the pictures lie. We've also had an interest in presenting pictures in correct context. And the most obvious example of this are the famous Sonderkommando photos, which for many years were shown in their cropped version. In fact, I used to have a book that I bought at the Auschwitz Museum in 1986, and in that book there were these pictures, and I distinctly remember that the versions of those pictures were all cropped. So you had a much different sense of how they were created. There is a body of literature now, I would say even a canon of of literature on photography and history and its intersection with the Holocaust. And the first person to write about this with real sensitivity and passion, and I still would use her work on Holocaust photography, is Susan Sontag. More recently, some pictures have been studied in great detail, including the picture on the right there is the Ravensbrück rabbits, and on the left is an atrocity photograph from Ukraine that has now been given treatment in a book by Wendy Lower called The Ravine. And I would recommend The Ravine to you if you're interested in seeing the latest kind of Holocaust research that is occurring by a noted Holocaust historian who earlier wrote that key book that I mentioned in class on women, SS women, or the helpers to the SS. And that book was called Hitler's Furies. The picture from the beach at Latvia has been given incredible treatment in a translated book. That book is by Nadine Fresco, and I did order a copy of this to the library, originally published in French, but very quickly translated and has appeared, and important work. But for me, one of the best and first that looked at the pictures critically was a book published by Routledge in London some 20 years ago by Janina Struck. Now, what's interesting is that there has been an attempt in the last few years to create a single database that curates all the known pictures from the Holocaust and provides annotations. And you can look at this project online. I think it's now complete. I'm not sure if they're still, doing publications and adding to it, but it was pretty interesting that this was a 3-year project that really sought to put together pictures from all over the EU, wherever they had been deposited in different museums or archives. Now, next, I want to look at a question in my broader topic, which is whither Holocaust studies. What is the future of Holocaust studies? And one of the points I want to make is that we're living right now in a critical moment. We are facing a biological imperative in that the very last survivors of the Holocaust will soon be gone. There are just a couple key people who remain. There are some others who are living in Israel or New York and who have never come to the fore. That is, they have never written a memoir or told their story, and they perhaps in the last years or months of their lives, they'll have something to say. One of the survivors who I think is still alive as I'm recording this lecture is Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who is the last surviving member of the Auschwitz Orchestra, led by Alma Rosé, Mahler's niece. That was the story that was told already in 1980 in the movie Playing for Time, which was based on the story by Fania Fenelon. And Anita has been in many documentaries and been interviewed and done a great deal of education work. And she's outlived Primo Levi by 40 years, and almost everyone else, all those that I admired or whose work I taught or who I met, people like Hetty Epstein or Marceline, who are gone now just in the last 10 years. But we do have a few left. So what does it mean to teach or to learn about the Holocaust when there are no more survivors? How is that going to change the field? How is it going to change education? Since a basic part of Holocaust education all of these decades was always the witness, and the witness being called in to speak to the next generations. And everyone that we've discussed who served this role, it was the same thing. They did trips to Auschwitz with students, or they wrote memoirs, or they went to schools, or they did interviews. And what will it mean when they're all gone? Who will take up the mantle? Who will carry on? Will it be, as I suggested the other day in lecture, will it be the witnesses of the witnesses? That is, will it be what we might call in French the témoins de témoins, the witnesses to the witnesses? So will it be those who interviewed, those who knew, who had a grandparent, who had some connection to the Holocaust? If you met a Auschwitz survivor, will you have a certain responsibility or some kind of pedagogical cachet that you must then pass on? Perhaps. A major area of concern and focus that I want to discuss is the problem of site preservation. And there are two kinds of sites that I want to mention here. On the one hand, you have the sites of the extermination themselves, that is, places like Majdanek or Sobibor or Belzec, which are much less visited than Auschwitz and Birkenau. So you have places that were either destroyed or partially destroyed by the Nazis at the end of the war, and there's been an attempt to turn them into memorials or museums or educational centers over the since the end of the war. So on the one hand, you have those places. They're sites of memory of the extermination. But you also have places of Jewish memory that predate the Holocaust. Now, the reason I bring this up is because if you had a flourishing Jewish civilization in Europe before 1939, it ceased to exist. It was in some places. Now, in some places it lives on, of course. In France, for example, the majority, 75% of French Jews survived, and therefore France has a very active, living, thriving Jewish community. But other places like Poland, like Eastern Czechia or Slovakia or Ukraine, especially, there the heart of Yiddish land was destroyed forever. But you still have some sites of pre-war Germany, pre-war Jewish culture that weren't destroyed, and the question is, who will take care of them now, with the Jews gone? And what you find if you visit these places, you visit them in Germany or Czechia or in Poland, what you see is that many of the sites of Jewish culture have been neglected, are crumbling, have been ransacked or vandalized even since the end of the war. So not necessarily even by the Nazis, or in most cases they are protected with gates and fences, and to prevent them from being vandalized, and instead of being destroyed by people, which would certainly happen if they're left in the open, instead it's nature that is gradually destroying them. And if you take a look at that link, I'm afraid to click on it because I'm in the middle of doing this recording. I'm not going to. Anyway, take a look at that link when you have a chance. Ruby filmed this in Vienna a couple years ago, and it is a look at what happens in the old Jewish cemeteries in Austria when there isn't a Jewish population that maintains them. Mm-hmm. Now I was at the new Jewish cemetery in Prague not long ago, and what was incredible about going through this beautiful cemetery is just how totally overgrown it is with English ivy and weeds. So the ivy has taken over the entire cemetery and weeds, with the exception of one grave. Only one grave was being maintained, and that's the grave of Franz Kafka. And it has so many stones on it that no weeds can possibly pop up because, as you know, it's a tradition to put a stone on a Jewish grave. So you have this giant pile of stones, just a few weeds along the edge, and then around it, surrounding it, are these graves of obscure Czech Jews whose lives predated the Holocaust, because the Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust were not buried anywhere. And this is the same cemetery. This is just around the grave of Franz Kafka, where you see the long line. They're all covered with ivy. Some of them are falling apart. Maybe they've been vandalized, or they just have. Eventually, they'll all fall down. And this is what these graves are like all over Europe. They aren't maintained. This is something a little different. This is Père Lachaise, and Père Lachaise is not the resting place of any Holocaust victims, but it is a site of a burial of Jews. Many Jews are buried in Père Lachaise, and it's much better maintained than the cemeteries in Germany or Czechia. The Père Lachaise is a great source of national pride, and it's well maintained. And whenever you're there, you see lots of legions of workers who are maintaining the place. And now, in addition to being the burial place of important Jews, and we could, for example, Gerda Taro or Gertrude Stein, whose graves I always visit when I'm there, you also have memorials to the camps. Now, I don't know any other place in Europe, anywhere, where you have an area of a major cemetery that has been devoted to the creation of different memorials to all of the sites of extermination. No, not all of them, but many of them. And each time I go there, I continue to see new ones, or ones that I didn't notice before, like this memorial at Ravensbrück. The one on the right, I forgot what it is, but it's the one that I've photographed many times. Every time I go there, I can't resist to getting shots of this. The picture on the left is to the memory of the children whose bodies were never returned. I think that's what it says there. Their only resting place is memory. I think that's what that says. And on the right is a memorial to, I should have this, but I can't remember. I thought maybe that was Auschwitz. There are so many. This memorial on the left is to the French or any other victims who were murdered through the Nacht und Nebel action. Nacht und Nebel, it was also called NN, and this was the decision made from 1941 to stop being so chivalrous towards and obeying international law when dealing with resistors to Nazi Germany, Nazi occupation. And Hitler and the SS decided that instead they would start disappearing people. It's a little like the American version of extraordinary rendition, though through that entire debate that came out of the Second Gulf War, now over 20 years ago, and the revelations about extraordinary rendition, which is the kidnapping of suspected terrorists or political opponents of the government. Through all of that, the revelations and the publications about it, we ended up knowing a great deal. There was never any mention that this was similar to Nacht und Nebel, that was the model for it. It was the disappearing of your enemies. They were kidnapped and they were taken to Germany and never seen again. And all we have then is, we have some literature and documentation about the program, and then we have a few memorials. But this is I think this one here on the left is the only memorial that I can remember seeing. The one on the right is to Flossenburg, and that name may mean something to you because this is the quarry site where the stone was cut and sent to build the Nuremberg Party rally ground. So the first major concentration camp that was used as slave labor for the creation of the great gargantuan Hitlerian building programs. This was Flossenburg, which is just a short, uh, maybe 45 minutes from Nuremberg. Well, just staying in Paris for a moment, the French have a unique way of remembering the Holocaust. It is not quite like anywhere else. And for example, if the ultimate homogenized, uniform form of Holocaust memory for individual Jews has become the Stolpersteine or skipping stones, I note that in Paris these aren't allowed. You don't have those, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about some of the problems with the Stolpersteine. I'll show you a few later in the process of installing them. But in Paris, what they do well are the plaques. They do plaques, they do libraries, archives, and the memory of the Holocaust is deeply embedded in French nationalism and in ideas of being French. There's a requirement to remember the Holocaust in French life because it is to remember French citizens. So the French Jews are not treated as an other, but they are understood to have been part of the French nation who were murdered. And so wherever you go, you see the plaques. And when you start looking for the plaques, it's like anything else. When you're looking for it, you see it everywhere. And in front of all schools in Paris, you have these black, well, some are black, some aren't, but most of the ones that I've seen have been black. And they they all say a variation on this, mostly the same thing: to the memory of the director and the staff and the students in this school arrested in 1943 and 44 by the police of Vichy and the Gestapo, deported and exterminated to Auschwitz because born Jewish. One of the first plaques I ever saw in Europe was one that I had read about, and it was presented in the guidebook. It was called Let's Go Europe, which I got my hands on a copy in 1983 or 84. And I read that if you went into East Germany, you should go to this synagogue on the Oranienburger Straße because there's a plaque there. And it's a plaque that remembers the burning out of this synagogue during the war. It was actually destroyed by the Allies when they were bombing Berlin, but it had also been sacked during the pogrom of November 1938, which is referred to here on the plaque as Kristallnacht, which since then in the contemporary German zeitgeist, it's not acceptable to call it Kristallnacht because that's a Nazi euphemism. It's called instead the pogrom of November 1938. Anyway, this plaque was set up in September 1966, and this was one of the reasons why I wanted to go to East Berlin to see it. And it says at the bottom, "Vergesst es nie," never forget this. And I didn't. You have memorials, a few anyway, to the Kindertransport. These are the ones in Liverpool and in Vienna. Um, there's also one, of course, in Northern Ireland at Mill Isle, and I think I showed you a picture of that before. Then you have the Berlin Memorial, which is only about 25 years old. I can't remember when it was finished. It was many years, the controversy surrounding the eventual creation, and what they settled on was this here, which is extremely it occupies the most prized real estate in all of Germany, the most valuable plot of land, and they gave this over to a huge outsized memorial to the Jews, which has the to be a part of this memorial, to interact with it, there's something that's just reflexively whimsical And it's very hard not to goof off when you're at that memorial. And to take teenagers there and expect them to do anything but have fun, darting in and out between these monoliths, I don't know who thought that it wouldn't be taken the wrong way. But there's a whole literature on this, and in fact, when you read the article "Monuments to the Unthinkable," you'll see a whole discussion of how this Berlin Memorial emerged. I've referenced it several times. Let's move on. So you have site preservation, you have different forms of memorial, and you have the in a number of sites you have the opportunity to visit these. And this is these are pictures of, I think this was my first trip. I've led, I think, 4 trips now to Auschwitz of students, and this was the first trip. There was another trip in 2009. I did 2 in a row. Anyway, those are the, how many did I take that year? It was a big group. I want to say 18 that year. Could that be? Anyway, everyone has to be photographed under this sign, but you can see from the picture, the crowds were far less back then, and much easier to go. And I thought that we had a lot of autonomy there. You weren't required to do a tour. I led the tour myself, which was allowed. And I must say, I preferred visiting Auschwitz earlier in the last, say, between the 1980s and the first decade of the 21st century. My last few visits have been a little bit, depressing for me to see what's going on there. The trip was, I suppose, to go to Auschwitz. It's like going anywhere else in that you are there. There are certain things you do when you travel that just because you're going to an extermination site, it doesn't mean you're not, excited to get on an airplane with your friends, and you pose along the way for pictures. You lug all your suitcases to the hotel or the hostel. There you see us going. It's just a regular trip. And then you get to the site, and again, it's not what you expected. There are lots of displays of nationalism when you go to these places. There are lots of flags. It's not a spirit of humanity at all, which maybe you weren't prepared for. You see lots of Israeli teenagers wrapped in flags, taking possession of the place, wearing the Star of David proudly. Um, the buildings at the Auschwitz Memorial Site are each of them have been given over to different national museums and collections. So the Memorial Museum is divided by nation, which already I find very bizarre, given that the Holocaust itself was a destruction of humanity. And the result of keeping all of these different national collections separate is that when you do a tour, you can simply ignore those that aren't relevant to the language group of whoever you're doing the tours for. So that my last 2 trips there, they refused to take us to the Russian exhibit. And there was no mention of the Red Army or any of the Russian exhibit. Is very well done and an enormous collection. And we weren't able to see that. The only way to see that anymore, unless you're with a Russian language tour group, would be to go in a bit later. In the afternoon, you can get an individual slot and visit without a guide. It's a long day going to both the Auschwitz Museum and then to Birkenau. And in between, you're going to need some sustenance. And there, I always take my students to this cafeteria. We eat, and it's just because you're at Auschwitz doesn't mean you're not hungry and couldn't tuck into a nice meal. This is let's see, I did the trip in 2018, 2018 was the last year I went, and this is that group. And it was already beginning to change, in that we had to do the only way to do it was a group tour, and we left the guide behind because I found the anti-Russian um, propaganda, or rather just leaving out the Russians, I found it a bit much. You're able to see the gas chambers dynamited. Wherever you go at these places, you're going to see people taking pictures, smiling. These plaques here cite some of the uh, facts of Auschwitz, and I I don't really understand why people smile for pictures at Auschwitz, but maybe it's just reflexive. I would recommend to you, the next time you go, or if you're going for the first time, that you don't stay in Krakow, that you get off the plane at Krakow, and then you get local transportation to Auschwitzim. This is the town that gave Auschwitz its name. Auschwitzim was renamed Auschwitz when that part of Poland became part of metropolitan Germany. This was not part of the general government. This was not occupied. It was folded into Germany. And the new name for it was Auschwitz. And Auschwitz and the camp, Birkenau and Auschwitz, are close enough to the center. They're maybe 2 kilometers from the center of Auschwitz. So you stay in a local hostel or hotel, and then you can just walk to the sites, and you can go at hours that are not heavily trafficked by the tourists, most of whom arrive on bus from Krakow. So from now on, whenever I go to Auschwitz, I'll stay in Auschwitzim. I'm really glad I got to do that. And even getting out of the train at Auschwitzim is a bit jarring, because you see that they retain the name Auschwitzim, and a place exists in the world, and lots of people live there, and it's called Auschwitzim. And it's an attractive little town. It's obviously not been touched by tourism. The tourists go to and from the concentration camp, and then they get out of there. But I really enjoyed walking along the river and seeing some of the old architecture, and also I found a wonderful pierogi place near the train station. I then walked from my hotel. I walked along the river, and there you will see the signage for Auschwitz. Now, even though Auschwitzim retains its name today, Auschwitz, the actual concentration and death camp, these are referred to by Auschwitz. So the only reference you have using the German nomenclature is for the death camp. And you will often see signs next to one another for Auschwitzim and Auschwitz. And I believe this is unique in all of Europe, in that elsewhere you don't have names you don't have special names for the sites of the memorial. Like if you go to Drancy, where French Jews were first held before being sent to Auschwitz, Drancy is still Drancy. It's a suburb, quite a poor suburb of Paris. And Drancy is also the site of the concentration camp. That's also true in Poland, where these places have the same name. So Treblinka is the name of both the village and the site of extermination. Birkenau is distinct from the Auschwitz Memorial Museum, and here you will again see people attempting to get their beautiful iconic picture to prove that they were there. You got to get one of some of the belongings in the buildings. Get a picture of the hair and the suitcases. Get a picture of the train station there, the entry to Birkenau. And one under the Arbeit macht frei steel sign. But I was fascinated by the ash ponds. I always have been. And that you can see the frogs and the flowers coming up exactly where the human ash was dumped during the Holocaust. There was a website that doesn't exist anymore, but we have some pictures of it, called Holocaust, where anyone who put up on social media, this is 20 years ago at the beginning of social media, anyone who put on social media an inappropriate picture of themselves at a Holocaust site would be shamed on the Holocaust website, and the only way to have that taken down is if you apologized. And so, where you had jugglers at the memorial in Berlin, they would have their picture of them juggling taken from the social media and put up on the Holocaust shaming site, and their picture would then be juxtaposed with things like corpses. Or where you had whimsical pictures of people jumping across the monolith there at the Berlin site, the author of the Holocaust would then shame them by having them jumping on pictures of corpses. Or if you're being clever and just very artsy, performing a little bit for your friends at the Berlin Memorial, your picture would be juxtaposed with masses of, what are those? Are they human? Are they corpses, or are they items taken from Jews? Yeah. And here, with a selfie stick, smiling, with their designer sunglasses, two hipsters, their picture is juxtaposed with piles of corpses. Or these two in front of pictures on a wall of the barracks. Well, where are they? Yeah, they're at the barracks, I guess, at Auschwitz. And they're doing a selfie, smiling, a kind of trophy. And you see that old phone, and it's juxtaposed with emaciated prisoners in the barracks. A central part of all of these memorial sites is the material culture that was left behind by the Jews, the shoes and the suitcases, the eyeglasses. All these things are elemental to the creation of these museums. People want to see their stuff. The Germans wanted their stuff. It's one of the reasons for the extermination, to enrich yourself from the things of the people you consider to be Untermenschen. And if the Germans wanted their stuff, then later on in the post-war period, when the memorials were constructed, the Holocaust tourists, the dark tourism pilgrims, they want the stuff. They want the stuff in rooms, in exhibitions. They want to be able to photograph it. Now, a different kind of memorial, and what has become the most common form of remembrance in the post-war memory of the Holocaust, are the Stolpersteine. These were created for the first time, originated some 25 years ago by a German artist called Günther Demning, who decided that victims of fascism should have their names inscribed on the pavement in front of the places where they lived and from which they were deported. And he begins this actually by remembering the Roma, the gypsies who were deported from Cologne. In the beginning, his first attempts at putting into the pavement, into the cobblestones, little specially created cobblestones with names, that was heavily resisted by the authorities. And wherever he did this, his first cobblestones, his first skipping stones were pulled up by the authorities. And he was threatened and fined, and in Cologne especially, the authorities refused to allow for the memory of Roma or Jews with this form. Well, believe me when I tell you that 20 years later, if you go to Cologne and take a city bus tour, the skipping stones will be one of the highlights of the tour, and Cologne will congratulate itself on being the site that originated the Stolpersteine, even though the city authorities and those who are still in power today were viciously against this form of memorial when it first began. This is the memorial stone of someone I've already mentioned, this is the skipping stone for Charlotte Solomon, who had gone into hiding in France. She was a Berlin Jew who had gone into hiding, who was then um, betrayed and arrested and sent to Drancy and then deported and murdered at Auschwitz. And she left behind an incredible testimony that she created in hiding called, what is it called? Life or Art. It's a kind of watercolor gouache, almost like a sort of cinematic graphic novel type thing. Really fascinating. There's a copy in the library. These are Stolper. Now I've been taking pictures of these Stolpersteine for a few years. Here's some that we saw in Salzburg last year, and this here you see that's a fancy hotel. It's a 4-star hotel, Imlauer Hotel Wien, Salzburg, and outside of this hotel is a single Stolpersteine for someone who had been born in 1871 and was murdered at Theresienstadt in 1943. So she was about 72 years old when she was murdered. And where she used to live, it doesn't exist anymore. Instead, a new hotel was built. And you just have this one stone right there, very remarkable, really, in front of this fancy hotel. And it always says the same thing at the top. It says, well, usually it says hier wohnte, here lived, and it's drawing a connection between the site of deportation, the last place the person lived, and then giving you some detail about where they were born, their maiden name. Here you see this person was called Alder Werelt, and her maiden name was Schindler. These are Stolpersteine that we saw in Salzburg, and you see how they quickly have a kind of tarnish on them from the elements. They have to be frequently polished. So on the one hand, the Stolpersteine, the laying of the Stolpersteine is a collective form of memorial, and then keeping them clean and maintained is also another kind of memory that's passed on. These are in a little better shape, and here we see different stories of Jews who lived in front of a building in Berlin. Some of them were murdered, some of them got to England. Some of them you see lived to 1992 and 1968. These were people who got out of Salzburg in 1938. They were the owners of a cinema. Hier wohnte die Besitzer des Admiralskino. So on the left you see a couple they were the owners of this cinema. They then they left, went to England, and then they died, I guess, in England. And then these were set up by their children. And on the right there were others who lived in the same building, and they were deported and murdered in Mali-Trostanets in Belarus, or in Lagów, I think that's in Poland. Now, let me say something about the Jews of Ostrava in Czechoslovakia, because I looked into this recently when I also was looking at Jewish life in Prague. And in Ostrava, Ostrava is kind of an interesting example of a Jewish community that was totally eradicated during the war, site of where Jews had lived for hundreds of years, which didn't have a remarkable Jewish community. There were no famous people, there were no famous Jews murdered from the community in Ostrava. Jews only numbered about 10,000 out of a population of over 300,000 people, so they weren't a very significant part of the population. They did all kinds of different trades in Ostrava. They were simply a regular community of busy working people who were lawyers or bankers or doctors or teachers or shopkeepers or innkeepers, or maybe they brewed beer, or they made sausage, or they were jewelers, or musicians, or writers. Uh, a few politicians, some farmers. They were just like the rest of the population. But because of the nature of the German occupation of Czechoslovakia from 1938, between 38 and 43, the entire community was eradicated forever. And we have surviving very little. We have a few photographs of a Jewish school from 1898. We have pictures of the synagogues. There were three synagogues in Ostrava. They were all destroyed. Nothing remains of them. I think I saw one plaque that remembered where a synagogue had been. You have very few Stolpersteine. Over 10,000 Jews lived in Ostrava. I think there are plans to have 30 Stolpersteine. I found only about maybe 15 when I was looking there. And many of the Jews from Ostrava were murdered at Theresienstadt, as you see here. These Stolpersteine are in front of a kind of popular restaurant where you can, a cafe, very kind of hip place. And you see read a little bit about the 5 Jews who lived in what was maybe the building that predated the one that's currently there. This is what the installation of the Stolpersteine looks like. And there you see the artist Gunther Demning at work. Typically, people bring flowers. The community, the people who live in the building organize this, pay for it. It's not free. It costs, I think now it costs 500 or 600 euros. You have to raise the money. Usually there are school children involved, or the neighbors, or the people who are currently living in the apartments of those Jews who were deported. Here is one of these actions. I think the Germans call it an action, Stolpersteine Aktion, from just a few years ago. The memorials remind me a little of the empty library memorial. Again, you have it on the ground. People look down and observe it. And this is the one that you can visit right near the opera on Unter den Linden. I think I've mentioned before the Vienna Judenplatz Memorial, which also is the form of a library, though with the books, all you can see are the opposite of the spine of the book, the page side. No titles are visible, and it evokes perhaps the potential of a civilization that has been destroyed, the cultural contributions that will never be made by those destroyed. But most remarkably, at the Judenplatz Memorial, you see the names of all the places where Austrian Jews were deported to. And what's clear from looking at this is that all of Europe were places for Austrian Jews to be murdered. So there was only one concentration camp in Austria at Mauthausen, but it was not one where Jews were sent. So the Jews weren't sent to Mauthausen to be exterminated, but they went all over the rest of Europe, including to France and Germany and Poland and Belarus and Ukraine, and you see all these places named there. Places like Stutthof, Theresienstadt, Troniki, which is on the Polish border, which gave us the famous Ukrainian Troniki guards that who worked in many of the sites of extermination in Poland. Zamość, which is near Belzec. Yeah, well, all of this changed, I would say, very distinct. The difference between the decade of the 1990s, which I call the decade of consensus, when it was really an Americanized memory of the Holocaust, then the decade of the 2000s, when you had a strong backlash to forms of memory that had flourished in those first 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, most spectacularly in the backlash against Jan Gross's neighbors. Holocaust studies in the next few years, I think, will be, on the one hand, the discovery of photography and the analyzing of that. The Holocaust archaeology, which, I mean, if you go to many of these sites today, to Chelmno or Sobibor in Poland, these are massive archaeological sites. They were neglected during the communist period. They were likely bulldozed or planted over by the Nazi Germans, and now they're being dug by student volunteers, and the sites are being reconstructed the way you would an archaeological site. You have still a few survivors who are active, like Jeanette Kolinka, born in 1925, the same year as Anita that I mentioned earlier, the cellist from Auschwitz. And Jeanette is still going with students to Auschwitz, incredibly, and speaking before groups in France. Very active survivor. Don't know for how much longer, though. This is the last slide, I think. Yes, it is the end. And we got to under 2 hours, or under an hour and a half, which is pretty good. The question remains, why study the Holocaust? And I'm going to suggest that the answer is inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and the Gnose Seoton. That's the answer. So if you know a little Greek, or you want to find the translation to that inscription, you'll have your answer. That's why we study it.